Nazi International, Part 4 by Burke Gumus, October 19th, 2023.
Excerpt from Contact Report 832.
This is despite the fact that all Nazi criminals, absorbed by America after the World War, were actually direct or indirect murderers and the like, and got away without punishment as a result of being absorbed by the USA.
Now associated with the USA, their descendants have been and are now sneakily and slimily allying with America's hegemonic drive to wage a fourth and strange world war. Behind this, there is perhaps a new plan and delusion to spread Germany around the world again and to make everything German. Just as in the last World War, the Nazi army wanted to Germanize everything in the eastern countries.
The German Wiedervereinigung reunification.
Hardly had the Berlin Wall come down. West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl's government told East Germany the way it's going to be. Then the newly reunified Germany began to revive some old, long dormant, but still festering traditional symbols. And one of the first traditional symbols to be revived, or rather reinterred, was Old Fritz, King Frederick the Great. At the stroke of midnight on August 17, 1991, a casket containing the bones of Frederick the Great was lowered into its original resting place at the Sanssouci Palace near Potsdam. The royal homecoming extravaganza, complete with black horse-drawn carriages, imperial flags, and a military honor guard, was broadcast live on German television. Chancellor Helmut Kohl and 80,000 others had come to pay their respects to the legendary Prussian monarch, who ruled an enlarged kingdom from 1740 to 1786. Several onlookers nodded approvingly at a sign in the crowd that read, "Prussia Lives." An ornate and lavish ceremony marked the end of a long odyssey for the body of old Fritz, whose remains had been spirited to Western Germany in the waning days of World War II to keep them from being seized by Soviet occupation forces. The collapse of communism rule in the German Democratic Republic paved the way for Frederick's return to his former dynastic retreat.
The burial place of King Frederick the Great on the 17th of August 1991.
Prussian King Frederick the Great, whose Eastern policy helped transform Prussia into a great power, and whose military reforms demonstrated Prussia's military prowess by fighting the superior forces of Austria and Russia to a standstill in the 7 Years' War, ended his reign with his country, the dominant military power in Central Europe. Frederick had introduced many of the traditions of the Teutonic Knights and most of the modern images associated with German military tradition.
Frederick the Great, 1763, left, / members of the Teutonic Knights right.
As the honor guard paraded with its World War I era imperial flags and regimental colors during the night hours, the imagery could not have been lost even on a casual observer. The new Germany was trying to identify itself with the old. Of course, Chancellor Kohl made the obligatory pro forma warnings about acknowledging the good with the bad, pointing out that Frederick, in addition to abolishing torture in Prussia and being a composer in his own right and a patron of the arts, had also developed the Prussian army and expanded Prussia's borders at the expense of Poland. No one seemed to have noticed, however. The bad side of Frederick was being honored with all the bad traditions of the Prussian military ceremonial Kohl had just cautioned against. Behind the symbolism, there lurked something else, For the newly reunited Germany was reviving not merely as many aspects of its traditional military pageantry as it could get away with, but the traditions of diplomacy, economics, and military muscle that Frederick epitomized.
Helmut Kohl in 1991.
President Jimmy Carter's former national security advisor and Polish émigré Zbigniew Brzezinski, himself trained by German historians, noted that the post-unification expansion of NATO had as much to do with Germany as it did making sure of Russia. By enveloping Germany in a wider Euro-Atlantic framework, NATO enlargement resolves Europe's central security problem of the 20th century, which has been how to cope effectively with the reality of German power. Whatever the value of Zbigniew Brzezinski's prognostications about the reality of German power may be, it will now be evident that the Nazi International was ahead of the game and, in fact, had anticipated this response. Moreover, they fully intended for it to come about. They not only helped orchestrate it and planned not only to be a part of it, but to lead it by positioning Germany at the core of a united Europe. In this context, it should not be surprising that Ursula von der Leyen is today at the helm of the European Commission, or maybe why Klaus Schwab, a child of Nazi Germany, is the head of the WEF, World Economic Forum. And when the Iron Curtain rusted away to be replaced once again by the Iron Cross, Germany not only rushed toward reunification Wiedervereinigung, but fully intended to exploit the power vacuum left in Eastern Europe by the Soviet departure and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. This exploitation would come in the form of German economic penetration and dominance of the region. By German diplomatic efforts designed to exploit ethnic divisions in polyglot nations such as Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, both fictitious nations created by and relics of the Treaty of Versailles, by cleverly recognizing breakaway nations and backing these up with German military force and the presence of significant numbers of German troops outside the borders of the fatherland for the first time since the Second World War. Consider the implications of the deal struck between Allen Dulles and Nazi military intelligence chief Reinhard Gehlen. The CIA was employing Gehlen's spies, many of whom were simultaneously members in the post-war neo-Nazi cells both in the eastern and western zones of Germany and Europe, organizations and cells that despised the United States. Their loyalty never initially belonged to the United States at all, it belonged to Nazi Germany. While the KGB thought it had turned many of Gehlen's agents against the West, those agents were able to pull off a convincing performance for their Soviet masters because their real allegiance remained where it started: Nazism. They played both sides for fools in a careful and delicate and patient dance, and taking their orders from the hidden directorate of the third position. At its height, Gehlen's organization had more than 4,000 agents inside of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and it was the de facto nucleus of NATO intelligence itself, supplying almost two-thirds of all of NATO's intelligence on the Warsaw Pact. In other words, the German BND was, and to a certain extent, is NATO intelligence. It is now well known that Gehlen's organization, after the conclusion of the notorious deal with Allen Dulles that transformed it into the operational Soviet desk in the early days of the CIA, deliberately fed disinformation to the USA in order precisely to whip up American fears of Soviet military capabilities and intentions, and accordingly drive the American military build-up and fan the fuels of an increasing debt load. Gehlen's strategy is based on a rudimentary equation: the colder the Cold War got, the more political space for Hitler's heirs to maneuver. He realized that the Nazi International could flourish only under Cold War conditions. As an institution, it was therefore committed to perpetrating the Soviet-American conflict. One of the most curious exercises of German military power outside German borders after the reunification was the deployment of the GSG-9, the same group that shot the hijackers of Lufthansa Flight 181 and rescued all its passengers in Mogadishu, Somalia. To rescue a German national in dubious circumstances, one Andreas Strassmeier. Only in this case, the GSG-9 was deployed not to an African third world country, but to the United States. Strassmeier's rescue by the GSG-9 was effected because of his involvement on the peripheries of the infamous Oklahoma City bombing. Strassmeier. According to eyewitnesses in Tulsa, Oklahoma had been seen in the company of Timothy McVeigh at the local strip bar called Godiva's on Sheridan Avenue by a local informant for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, Carol Howe. But what was so unusual about Strassmeier that would require the involvement of the German GSG-9 to get him out of the country? As the circumstances surrounding the OKC bombing began to be probed in the days and weeks immediately after the event by radio talk show hosts and independent investigative journalists, the riddles connected to the mysterious Mr. Strassmeier only grew. One such radio talk show host, Chuck Harder of the People's Radio Network, reported on his show the strange events that unfolded in the immediate aftermath of the bombing that directly concerned Strassmeier. According to Harder and his reporters, at a routine police roadblock near Muldrow and Rowland, Oklahoma, just over the border from Fort Smith, Arkansas, Strassmeier was apprehended by local deputies for driving without a license or valid plates. According to some versions of the story, Strassmeier also had with him an attaché case, which he refused to open and that he claimed were full of papers. Under the circumstances, the deputy, suspicious, incarcerated Strassmeier in the local jail. Sometime later, the local sheriff's department, or, depending on the version of the story, local highway patrol, began to receive phone calls insisting that the sheriff release Strassmeier. What made the calls strange, however, were that they came from no less than the then governor of Oklahoma, Frank Keating, and a Pentagon lieutenant general. Both insisted that Strassmeier had diplomatic immunity and thus could not be arrested for anything. Then things began to get strange. As reporters probed further into this unusual McVeigh associate, they discovered that he had come to this country with the ostensible purpose of being a participant in Civil War battle reenactments. Strassmeier told his lawyer that he merely was a Civil War enthusiast and a reenactor, and wanted to participate in the numerous reenactments at the historical sites. But the reality was quite different. Strassmeier, it turned out, was a former lieutenant in the Bundeswehr, the German army, and moreover a graduate of Germany's prestigious Hanover War Academy, Germany's version of West Point, and had served honorably with the German army in its elite mechanized armored infantry units. Not only this, but Strassmeier resided at Elohim City, a notorious white supremacist religious group in Oklahoma with its own deep and broad connections to a variety of underground American neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups. Moreover, Strassmeier was the compound's security chief, who trained the group in survival tactics, small arms tactics, guerrilla operations, and so on.
Andreas Karl Strassmeier.
The German paramilitary expert admitted in a court affidavit that he had met McVeigh at a Tulsa gun show shortly after the Waco massacre. Strassmeier sold a combat knife to McVeigh and gave him his business card. That's as far as it went, according to Strassmeier, who insists that he had no further dealings with McVeigh. While in Tulsa, Strassmeier also visited the home of his beer-drinking buddy, Dennis Mahn, the Oklahoma-based Klansman who lit crosses in reunified Germany. and Mahn often spent weekends at Elohim City, boozing it up with Strassmeier. Strassmeier denies any involvement in the Oklahoma City attack. See article. The military-industrial complex, too, to learn more about the possible sinister mind control machinations in context with Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bombing and Nazi Germany. There is no doubt, however, that he had extensive links to America's violent racialist underground. Strassmeier's roommate at Elohim City was Michael Brescia, who subsequently confessed to his own role as a member of the Aryan Republican Army, ARA, a fanatical white supremacist sect that sought to overthrow the U.S. government, purge the country of blacks and Jews, and install a new legal system based entirely on their own weird interpretation of the Bible. 4 of the 6 known ARA members lived at Elohim City, or often visited there. To raise money for the cause, the ARA robbed 22 banks in 8 Midwestern states during the mid-1990s. These armed assaults were carried out by ARA extremists who had been trained in weapons and guerrilla tactics by Strassmeier. The ARA's German paramilitary instructor managed to elude the long arm of the law, even though the Oklahoma State Patrol had issued a bolo be on the lookout alert for Andreas Strassmeier, which indicated that he was an armed and potentially dangerous illegal alien. Although several U.S. government agencies were aware of Strassmeier's presence at Elohim City, immigration authorities never tried to deport him. As the news reporters doggedly sniffed out the Strassmeier trail, however, it suddenly went completely cold. Until the young German suddenly showed up at his family home in Berlin, gave a brief press conference stating that he was indeed alive and well and not completely missing. After all, by that time, all of America's law enforcement agencies were looking for him and then faded quietly from view. So, what had happened between the mysterious phone calls to the local law enforcement in Roland, Oklahoma from Governor Keating and the anonymous Pentagon Lieutenant General, and Strassmeier's sudden reappearance in his native Germany? According to Strassmeier's close friend, an American attorney, Kirk Lyons, a man not without his own connections to America's radical underground right and others, Strassmeier was spirited out of this country by none other than Germany's elite GSG-9 commando unit. Substantiating claims of Strassmeier's possible deep involvement and connection to intelligence and elite paramilitary units, researcher Victor Thorne recounts 2 relevant incidents. Shortly after arriving in this country, Strassmeier eventually made his way to Texas, where he aligned himself with a citizens' militia called the Texas Light Infantry Brigade. The only problem was, the members of the group quickly became suspicious of Strassmeier's motivations and loyalty, so they followed him late one night to a federal building. There they saw Strassmeier approach an electric lock on the door, upon which he punched in the code on an electronic keypad. And just like that, Strassmeier gained access to the building. What makes this scenario relevant is that the federal building conveniently housed an office of the ATF. Anyway, after witnessing this transgression, the Texas Light Infantry Brigade gave Strassmeier his walking papers for being a suspected undercover agent. There is one highly significant fact that places the story of the GSG-9 rescue of Strassmeier in a very different light, making it not only possible that it was involved in Strassmeier's rescue, but likely. When the Berlin Wall came down, and West Germany for all intents and purposes annexed East Germany, Andreas attended the reunification ceremonies with his father, Günther Strassmeier, and Chancellor Helmut Kohl himself. This is significant, for after Strassmeier showed up in Berlin once again after having suddenly disappeared in the USA, officials investigating the Oklahoma City bombing attempted to question him in 1997 and requested intelligence files and information from the German government. Germany, not surprisingly, replied that it had no police or intelligence files concerning Strassmeier and absolutely no data on him whatsoever. An odd statement given the fact that Strassmeier was a former officer in the German army, a graduate of its war academy, and more importantly, the son of Günther Strassmeier, the head of the Christian Democrat Union Party in Berlin, Chancellor Kohl's chief of staff, a minister without portfolio, and one of the masterminds of the German reunification itself. The reunification revealed another sinister fact about post-reunification German and Eastern European politics. For despite the fact of decades of communist rule, neo-Nazi, neo-fascist and radically right-wing nationalist groups had secretly grown and festered throughout Eastern Europe, and nowhere more strongly than in the provinces of the former East Germany. For example, in elections held in April of 1998, Deutsche Volksunion, a scarcely disguised neo-Nazi political party, managed to win a stunning 13% of the vote in regional elections in Sachsen-Anhalt province. Another thinly disguised neo-Nazi party, the National Democratic Party, also won significant percentages in other local elections in the former Eastern Zone. These successes were attributed to the fact that these parties appealed to smouldering German resentment against the number of non-ethnic German foreign workers in the country, who, the parties alleged, were stealing jobs from native Germans. No one seemed to have noticed that the former Eastern Zone had less than 1% of its population composed of such foreign workers. With these election victories and Kohl's re-election bid pending at a national level, his government and Christian Democratic Union Party careened to the political right to such an extent that it became increasingly difficult to discern where political expediency ended and right-wing extremism began. Why had Kohl and the Christian Democratic Party lurched so far to the right? A dangerous move even after reunification, since the vast majority of Germans who lived in the former West Germany would never support such a government, at least, not openly. In order to appreciate the full significance of the neo-Nazi connections of Kohl's government, his party's rightward lurch, and the subsequent policies of his left-wing Social Democrat successor, Gerhard Schröder, it is necessary to examine the real tough in the United States almost unknown role that neo-Nazi groups actually played in orchestrating and driving the reunification. As open protests against communist regimes grew throughout Eastern Europe, first in Poland with Lech Wałęsa's Solidarity movement, and then other Eastern European nations, similar protests naturally began in East Germany, the most notoriously communist and pro-Soviet government in the former Warsaw Pact. Initially, these protests were led by East German intellectuals who, far from desiring a collapse of the East German state and reunification with the much more powerful West German government in Bonn, merely wished to introduce reforms that would introduce a mix of socialism and capitalism, the Nazi-inspired Third Way, once again, to the East German state. But as the protests spread throughout East Germany and finally reached Berlin, with West Berliners and East Berliners climbing the wall and beginning to tear it down, something else had happened. The covert neo-Nazi groups in the Eastern Zone came out in force and propelled the release of populist energy in a new direction, reunification. It did not take long before the uglier side of German nationalism began to assert itself. In Leipzig and other East German cities, skinhead youth hoisting flags of the 1937 German Reich marched alongside of those demanding unification. Soon, proponents of unity, including neo-Nazi militants, started to clash openly with those who still cherished the possibility of an independent East German state. It does not take a Nazi rocket scientist to figure out the parallelism at work, for in a manner similar to the Nazi Party's original private army of brown shirts, which literally physically brutalized its political opponents into submission and silence, Those opposing reunification were physically silenced and effectively closed out of any debate. A series of violent attacks against ethnic non-Germans throughout the newly reunified country broke out spontaneously, primarily in the former East Germany. Utilizing a neo-Nazi computer network called the Thule Network, an international electronic fascism consisting of a tapestry of bulletin boards, blog sites and so on, and cell phones, neo-Nazi groups published information on political rallies, how to publish newsletters, and gave practical advice on the use of paramilitary political violence. One of the most significant of these violent attacks against non-German ethnic groups was the Rostock incident. German law enforcement officials turned a blind eye to the neo-Nazi-inspired violence in Rostock. The police had an arrangement not to intervene. One may perceive it for what it really is. The exploitation on the European scene of the same ethnic and economic tensions the Nazi International exploited so successfully elsewhere in the post-war world. And that means that as late as the mid-1990s, Martin Bormann's Nazi International was alive, well, and able to mount a coordinated effort right in the heart of Europe, and to drive both sides of a crisis by carefully advocating an East German third position reform as the thesis, propelling the neo-Nazi cooperation of that movement by demands for reunification, yet another third position, and proposing a unilateral scheme for reunification from Kohl's expellee society-influenced government itself. Make no mistake, this is not some flaw in the German national character or some wayward gene in the Teutonic gene pool. This was the result of an evil, brutal, and genocidal ideology that once ruled and exploited the flaws, and that was still well-organized, well-financed, and inherently predisposed to do so once again. Without the neo-Nazis, there would have been no reunification. No sooner was the fatherland one big happy Reich once again than Germany began to flex its economic and military muscle on the European stage. The precipitous implosion of the Soviet Union into 15 separate countries left a huge power vacuum on the continent, a vacuum that a reunified Germany, by virtue of its pivotal location and economic might, was poised to fill. No longer confined to the perimeter of the Atlantic system, Germany would once again become the arbiter of Central Europe, a geopolitical construct that lay dormant while the Federal Republic bode its time as a frontline state during the Cold War. German hegemony throughout the region, consciously pursued, appeared to be a fait accompli. Central Europe is going to have a strong German flavor again, said retired State Department officer Douglas H. Jones. Even if it's not intentional, Germany could lurch into a destabilizing role. In a certain sense, the Soviet implosion and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact created such a vacuum that Germany literally was sucked into a dominant role in Eastern Europe once again. But it was not as if the German government and German business were not ready for the eventuality. The high cost and reunification necessitated a penetration in depth rather than breadth on the smaller economies of Eastern Europe. Accordingly, Germany invested strategically rather than profusely in Eastern Europe, focusing on crucial areas such as energy supplies, transportation, telecommunications, and mass media. This soon translated into new political muscle on the world stage, and a bossier manner as Germany began to insist upon a United Nations Security Council seat, and that Germany be elevated to the status of an official language within the European community.
Breaking free of NATO.
These moves were almost simultaneously accompanied by similar German assertiveness regarding NATO and its own armed forces. Germany's Constitutional Court, in a crucial 1994 ruling, declared that the German armed forces could participate in military operations beyond NATO's jurisdiction, and the then German Defense Minister, Volker Ruhr, In a Bundeswehr German army, white paper circulated within the upper echelons of the German defense and intelligence establishment that same year, stated that the German army would henceforth function as an instrument of foreign policy. Reunified Germany had served notice, quietly but very firmly, that the gloves were off once again, and that Washington and Moscow would no longer have virtual veto power over Germany's defense and diplomatic agendas. As the then German Foreign Minister Klaus Kinkel put it, the 1994 court decision and Bundeswehr white paper gave Germany freedom of action in foreign policy. The brake that was holding us back is gone. With all these statements and maneuvers happening quietly, while most major Western media outlets scarcely covered them, it should come as no surprise that newly reunified Germany quickly became the world's second-largest exporter of arms, second only to the United States. And after having absorbed the former East German army, Germany could afford to reduce its standing army to 350,000. Which still made the well-equipped and competently led Bundeswehr the largest army in Europe, and one of the largest standing armies for a nation of its population in the world. But Germany's intentions did not stop there. NATO itself, which had been intended as a check on both Soviet and, at the time of its formation, potential German expansion, was now revealed for what it was, at least as far as Germany perceived it. Although NATO was supposed to contain Germany as well as Russia, it proved to be the vehicle through which German military power was restored. And now that the superpower face-off had ended, German leaders indicated that they were ready to develop new security structures outside of NATO, including a European military force composed initially of 35,000 French and German soldiers. France, as the world's third-largest thermonuclear power, now in second place, coupled with Germany, would be a powerful economic and military alliance in its own right. The proposal from the newly relocated German government in Berlin was, needless to say, the source of some consternation at green-topped conference tables in Washington, D.C. and Wall Street, where the continental outlook of both European powers might well indeed translate into such new security measures. But even greater concern was quietly expressed when German military think tank openly reasserted the German claims to sovereignty and Germany's nuclear weapons research program. Even the publisher of Germany's popular liberal magazine, Der Spiegel, the Mirror, openly declared that situations could be conceived that Germany would have to have its own nuclear deterrent in spite of existing treaties. Yet, with world attention focused on Iran's potential nuclear popgun, not a word has been said in the major Western media about the far larger nuclear and thermonuclear potential of Germany, which, like Japan, could arm itself to the teeth with such weapons in a very short time if the situation demanded. For in fact, Germany never stopped perfecting and developing the means of isotope enrichment that it had begun to develop in World War II, and indeed was one of the world's major exporters of such technologies along with Russia and France. If there is any doubt about Germany's role in the proliferation of nuclear weapons, consider only Bonn's role in the military build-up of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, a role that, despite the US media's description of the facts, far outstripped the Soviet Union's role, for it was Germany, not Russia, that gave to Saddam the beginnings of his nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons programs. With the full knowledge and cooperation of the federal government and its BND spy apparatus, dozens of German companies were instrumental in helping Saddam Hussein develop one of the world's most diversified unconventional warfare arsenals. Several of West Germany's biggest firms supplied equipment and expertise to set up entire plants for the production of nuclear, chemical, and biological weaponry. Other countries, including the United States, cashed in on the macabre bonanza that created Iraq's high-tech death machine during the 1980s, but Bonn's role far outstripped the international competition. In addition to constructing Saddam's underground bunker and extending the range of the Scud missiles to be able to hit Israel, German engineers concocted new delivery systems for poison gas and dispensed advice on the most efficient way to enrich uranium into weapons-grade fuel for a nuclear bomb. Bonn, in fact, from the period of the First Gulf War in 1991 up to the Second Anglo-American invasion in 2003, bluntly thumbed its nose at repeated American and United Nations trade embargoes on Iraq and continued to provide Iraq with missile parts, chemical agents, and state-of-the-art engineering equipment, and later it would be disclosed that the BND had trained Iraqi and Libyan secret police units. These abrupt policy and attitude changes in Bonn and Berlin after the reunification were quickly followed up by very real flexing of German military and diplomatic muscle in several independent moves that signaled Germany's new independence on the international geopolitical scene. These initiatives concentrated on revising Versailles, once again, by exploiting the growing nationalism within Versailles, created multi-ethnic nations such as Yugoslavia, a polyglot nation with significant minorities of Roman Catholic Croatians, Bosnian and Kosovan Muslims, and the majority Eastern Orthodox Serbs and Czechoslovakia, another polyglot nation stitched together from Bohemian Czechs to Slovenian Slovaks and Ruthenians. And more ominously, Germany quietly signaled that it was also prepared to begin the long-term recovery of its lost eastern provinces, areas of territory occupied by modern-day Poland and Russia. Indeed, if the newly reunified Germany was to dominate Central Europe and Eastern Europe once again, these two relatively powerful polyglot nations, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, created by Versailles precisely to encircle Germany, had to be broken apart. If this sounds familiar, it should. For Adolf Hitler did one and the same thing to both countries, breaking Czechoslovakia apart prior to absorbing it, and absorbing Yugoslavia before breaking it apart and recognizing a puppet Nazi-controlled regime in Croatia. All that was missing this time were the black uniforms and jackboots. This time, however, there was a change in tactics, as neo-Nazi groups, with funding from covert backing of the Bonn government, were deliberately creating a German minority in Poland by buying up formerly German property in the formerly eastern provinces of the Reich. They openly purchased former German lands from cash-strapped Poland and established radio stations, printed newsletters, posted bilingual street signs in Polish and German, and changed the names of villages once a sufficient German presence was re-established, from their Polish names back to their German ones. Poland naturally protested these activities directly to Bonn. Bonn's response was to demand that Warsaw give special rights and privileges to ethnic Germans in Silesia and Pomerania, and that they be allowed to carry German passports and vote in German elections. Warsaw had little choice but to knuckle under and caved in to these demands. Similar machinations befell the Russian oblast or province of Kaliningrad, which was but the northern portion of the former German province of East Prussia. The German city of Königsberg had been renamed Kaliningrad by the Soviets, who openly annexed the province at the end of the war and tried their best to Russianize it, transforming the port city into a major Baltic naval base for the Soviet Navy. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, however, and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, the Kaliningrad Oblast hangs precariously isolated between the German-dominated Baltic states and Poland. This time, Bonn was not so subtle, for it openly offered government financial incentives to any Germans, including relatives of the original German inhabitants of the city, to settle in Kaliningrad. The city soon became a magnet for right-wing extremists, who moved to the city in droves, bringing a host of German corporate branch offices, including a newly opened branch of Deutsche Bank not far behind them. It is significant that the German government, which has on the books of its legal code laws against legitimizing Nazism or neo-Nazism, nonetheless opened its treasury to such groups who wished to move to Kaliningrad. The city has thus become a haven, almost a Vatican, for European-based neo-Nazi groups. If Czechoslovakia, Poland, and even Russia were faced with invasions of former German territories by German-wielding not tanks, dive bombers, and heavy artillery, but Deutschmarks, Yugoslavia was not so lucky. Yugoslavia soon succumbed to the rising tide of neo-fascist-inspired nationalism in the former communist governments of Eastern Europe, when a breakaway Croatian republic was proclaimed in the former capital of the Nazi puppet Croatian Ustashi regime's capital, Zagreb. The breakup of that country, which the rest of the European Union with the United States attempted to prevent, was aided, abetted, and finally realized by the actions of one nation, Germany, when that nation unilaterally recognized Croatia as an independent nation toward the end of 1991, scarcely 2 years after the reunification. Despite the fact that the administration of President George Herbert Walker Bush charged Germany with contributing to the swiftly deteriorating conditions and escalating civil war in Yugoslavia, Germany openly defied Washington's protests and a United Nations arms embargo to the newly recognized country, supplying Croatia with almost $320 million of military hardware, including MiG fighter jets, 49 surface-to-air missiles, and late-model tanks. Having created the Balkan crisis by its precipitous diplomatic unilateralism, Germany then cleverly hid behind the auspices of NATO as Croatia and other minority republics formed from the former Yugoslavia requested NATO assistance to fight the militarily superior Serbia, which was fighting, after all, for its own territory. Thus, under the official diplomatic protection of the NATO alliance, Luftwaffe Air Force, fighter bombers, and fighters flew patrols over Croatia and Bosnia, preventing the Serbian Air Force from even penetrating their airspace. When Croatia requested German military personnel on its territory to enforce a peace accord between Croatia and Serbia in 1995, Germany only too readily agreed, and thus, for the first time since World War II, the German military was deployed beyond the borders of Germany in significant numbers. It was General Klaus Naumann, the first military chief of reunified Germany, who in fact pressured Bonn to send his troops to Croatia and Bosnia to gain actual combat experience. It was an event that marked a new phase in a gradual, step-by-step process orchestrated by German leaders to expand their influence across the continent. Critics warned that the Bosnia assignment would open the door to future military intervention in other areas, a development that Germany had prepared for by creating a highly mobile, 50,000-strong strike force capable of rapid deployment in any part of the world. On June 18, 1994, General Naumann's Bundeswehr troops celebrated the final departure of British, French, American, and Russian troops from Berlin with a Prussian-style torchlight parade in front of Berlin's Brandenburg Gate. It was a celebration to which the British, Americans, and Russians were not invited by the German government, but this was, really, nothing new. When Hitler's favorite Luftwaffe Air Force, ACE, and a significant member of Bormann's post-war Nazi International, Hans-Ulrich Rudel, died in 1982, over 2,000 people attended his funeral, many of whom paid their respects by stretching out a single arm and in unison bellowing the banned pro-Nazi verses of Germany over everything. As they did so, 2 Luftwaffe fighter jets flew over the site, dipping their wings low in salute of the former ace. Hans Ulrich Rudel acted as a corporate ambassador for the giant German electrical firm of Siemens in Argentina, where Rudel made his home for years after the war.